Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here for this session. It's a great topic. I'm Rick Thompson. I'm one of the co-founders of Green Tech Media, and we do a number of things, but a lot of you may know the news that we publish, but the core of the company is actually based in market research, a lot more in-depth than what you see on our site. And one of the major practices that we have is looking at essentially this question and all the underlying technologies that surround it, and it's, probably a question that I think is being asked in the industry more than any other one at the moment, and there certainly aren't any easy answers, so it'll be great to hear from this group of panelists, what their thoughts are on it. We've got a great group here, a mixture of, gas, electric, and water utilities, and with Capgemini on the consulting side, so I think we should get a good mix of responses. So before I let these gentlemen introduce themselves, I just have two kind of quick questions for you. One, like how many of you are, I'm just kind of, I want to get a sense of like who's kind of from the gas, water, and electric industry. How many are electric? Okay, the most, okay, that's what I kind of figured. Gas? Oh, a fair amount, oh, some both, yeah. And water? Okay, good. And the second question, more importantly, is how many of you are happy that both the Steelers and the Mets won last night? Anyone? I'm from Pittsburgh and I live in New York, so it was a good night for me. Oh yeah, and the Blue Jays won. That was good too. So, all right. So with that, I'll have the panelists kind of introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your role in your organization, and we'll get into some questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michel Gévry. I've been with Capgemini for 15 years now. Been working with utilities for more than 30. And I'm responsible for, I'm the deputy leader for the global practice. And so I work with many global customers, including obviously some of you. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Roger Schwecke, Vice President of Customer Solutions for Southern California Gas Company, affiliate of Sempra Energy. Within my organization, I have a variety of activity from advertising marketing to e-services, RD&D programs, emerging technology programs, all our energy efficiency customer programs, so a wide spectrum of activity associated with the customers. The question also was, what interests us about this? Come on, thinking about the future. What better thing is there to do? As a utility, we spend a lot of time dealing with the day-to-day activity. But being able to think about the future, what's coming, what's the business environment, how it's changing, how do we have to change? It's a great feeling to be able to have your crystal ball be successful. And since you brought it up, it's kind of like, your fantasy football team that you made changes on Friday and did great by come Monday afternoon, right? So the future is always interesting to think about.
Great.
Mike Vogel, Deputy Director of Customer Support for the City of San Diego. We're a water and sewer agency. My areas of responsibility include things like meter reading, our customer call center, and most of our customer interaction channels, as well as our quality assurance and billing, payment processing, all of those types of activities. I think one of the things that why I find this topic so interesting is, first of all, I plan to retire in the short term, and so really thinking about things now and making sure that we're setting up our organization for the long haul. If we don't start thinking about them now, then we won't be sustainable. So,
I'm Roger Woodworth, the officer with Vista Utilities out of Spokane, Washington. If you delve a little bit into our history, you'd find that we were the company that started Itron. It's a little bit of factoid there. That was many, many years ago, and we don't have any financial relationship anymore, but are still partners, like all of you are. In my own role as the Chief Strategy Officer, I've enjoyed that for the last 5 years at our company. We're headquartered in Spokane, but we have gas and or electric operations across 4 different states, including most recently Alaska, just added to our portfolio. I've had the benefit the last 5 years of being asked to ponder this question. It's not easy coming up with perfect answers for it, but essentially my CEO 5 years ago said, our industry is facing all kinds of problems, our utility no different. What I'd like you to think about are the things and actions that we should take today that help us be prosperous generations from now. So I've enjoyed a rather rare opportunity the last 60 months just to ponder these kinds of things and try to help at least our company respond in a more affirming way for a longer term future to meet what Mike just described. leave things in good hands as we retire and pass the baton.
Great. Well, this first question, and it's probably good, this one's relatively broad, so it might be good to get a kind of sense from each of you. Start with you, Roger. We can kind of work our way back, and then I kind of want to keep this as a discussion too. So if you have other points, don't hesitate to chime in.
So if I can boomerang it back to Michelle?
Absolutely, yeah. Do you think the utility business model will look very differently in 10 years from now? And if so, in your crystal ball, how? And then I'd also kind of like to get a sense of, since we have a good mixture of different types of utilities, what that might look like differently from a gas, water, and electric perspective.
You use the word very different.
Yeah.
That I'm not so sure, but different, definitely. As you think about the future and all the challenges we face, there are certain things, let's use that we can use hard trends, not fads, or whatever vernacular you prefer from our keynote speakers. But it's very likely to be true that our future is more distributed and more integrated. That didn't displace the central service, the central grid, but the idea of new technologies that are coming, and that those new technologies for the whole to be stronger and better, means that they have to be integrated in some new way. So I think that's one thing, more distributed and more integrated. I think the future will be different in another way too, and it's one that sometimes we don't think about because we get caught up in the technology. But it's this idea that the future is more relational and more dynamic. So not just dynamic among the technologies, but because there's so much more diversity, this idea of the Internet of Things, or I think Cisco labels it maybe more appropriately, the Internet of Everything, because it's not just about the things, it's also about the processes, and it's also about the people, right? When you think about the entire supply chain of any utility, gas, water, or electric, we have influence over almost every aspect of the supply chain. But the one we have the least influence over, the least understanding of, is the customer. And yet the technology is equipping customers to do more things that influence the system. So this idea of a relational or more personalized kind of a system, I think, is in our future, and that could make it very different depending on how things unfold. The third thing I would add for the conversation is this idea of how data changes the prospects for everything. We're going to have a greater asset in the amount of information that comes to us. And what we do with it will, in part, define how different the future is on two fronts. One of those is this concept I'll introduce to you called radical efficiency. Not just trying to get better at improving what we already do, but reducing the cost to do even more, to improve our outcomes, radical efficiency. So we push on both sides of the curve, cost down and outcomes better, up. And the second is in the discovery of new services, understanding customers and our own systems in new ways that open the door to different kinds of value that we can deliver across our infrastructure, again, be that gas, water, or electricity. So any one of those things could make it very different. All of them together are in motion, and they will make the future different. 10 years from now, no different than if we look back from 10 years ago.
Right. Mike?
I hope it looks different. I mean, I think that, and I'm absolutely confident that it will. I think one of the things I would like to see is just really more about the relationships, the people, whether it's customers, employees. I think one of the things that we see right now is rates are continuing to increase. We get more and more efficient, but still there's more and more people that are kind of left behind. In the sense of customers, it's still, we in the water utility agencies, we don't have the same robust low-income programs and things like that. In California, we have a lot of restrictions. So trying to tackle that as the price of water increases. I expect that over the next 10 years, we'll see that change dramatically just because so many more people are going to be impacted by that in a negative way if there isn't some solution for that. So I would hope that would be one area. With regards to our employees and the customers that we interact with on a regular basis, obviously generational changes, we're seeing that, fewer people sending in checks, more people using mobile devices and so forth to interact with us. But I think that one of the things that's really, that I think is going to be expected and that we're going to have to deliver on over the long term is again, building those personal relationships, both with our customers and then also satisfying the needs of this whole new workforce that's coming on board so that we can attract those competent, great folks, and then they'll match up nicely with the customers as they change as well. So.
That's an interesting point. Like that, you know, there's a lot of different, you know, tech markets that are very attractive for, you know, young engineers, marketers, you know, whatever role you may fill in, you know, a company like an electric utility or a telecoms operator or internet company. How is that going in terms of getting like younger, smarter, you know, folks to kind of come into an industry that they might perceive as a little slower and not quite as exciting as something in Silicon Valley, for example?
So let me kind of address that.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you get down to it, the utility business is not sexy.
I mean, it's
just
probably
not.
as sexy now as it has ever been.
Whether
So
it's gas, electrical, water. But I think what we're seeing is as we're evolving to be more focused on the customer, to use more technology, I think we're seeing more of the, you know, the younger, the ambitious, the entrepreneurial types come into the utility. And I think we're allowing them that flexibility that they want to see outside with some of the stability that the utility provides. I've been with the utility business, you know, for over 30 years. I think Roger was saying the same, and Mike. But they look at it from the standpoint of my day-to-day challenge. And I think we're getting people coming in because they see they can make a difference. Mm-hmm. Especially when you start looking at climate change issues in California, you know, renewable power. That makes it more interesting for them. Keeping those employees, that next generation of employees, is going to be tough because they have different needs and expectations. We constantly have, at least in my group, you have on the advertising and marketing side, a lot of people have only been with the utility for 1 or 2 years. Mm-hmm. And they're wondering, okay, what's next? When's my next promotion? When's my next job? And they want to move. And we have to be acceptance that they're not going to be around for 30 years. They may be only around for 2 years. Mm. But they may come back. We've had a lot of people leave and come back and leave and come back. So it's a little different model for the utility when it comes to employees.
Yeah, that's interesting. You guys finding similar?
Well, one of the things we've done recently is really focus, once we do get people in the door, that really focus on trying to keep them there. I mean, we understand some folks aren't going to stick around forever, so we understand that, but it's just changing our organization so it's not so much a top-down organization. It's more we have a new emerging issues council where we've pulled people from throughout the organization at all levels. Brand new employees, I would call them the less jaded, more optimistic folks in many cases. So we've had to do that, and every time an issue comes up, we take it to that group first, and we get their ideas. So I think doing things like that to make them feel included in the process, so they don't have to wait. They don't have to work there 20 years to add value and feel that they've made a difference.
Okay. Great.
One of the 4 pillars of transformation here, definitely how you treat your own organization. And those newcomers are definitely looking at digital transformation being something that needs to be applied to their own jobs. Not just for the customer experience side or for the operational efficiencies, but definitely what are the tools I'm going to work with myself? And is it appealing to work on new games? Or is it better to work on virtual reality, on a utility, going into its assets, looking and monitoring performance on those assets, all of that in 3D into a controlled room. So when technology comes in and helps bringing those organizations to a better position in their market, then obviously people will come and work with utilities or any type of other businesses that would take advantage of all of those new technologies.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. All right, I didn't mean to kind of derail the original question, but I want to get your perspective, Roger, on kind of where you see the business model in 10 years and how it might differ kind of on the gas side.
You know, Roger mentioned, you said very different. 10 years for utility, probably not significant change. I mean, it will not be the change that we saw in phone services over the last 10 years. I mean, that leaps and bounds with regard to technology and cellular service. and the smartphone. But it is changing. You look at what's happened on the electric side, with, especially in California, with the installation of rooftop solar. I mean, that's changed the model and continually changes. Also the drive by, our state governor and legislature to get to that 50% renewable standards. On the gas side, it's starting to change, and in two ways. One is, how do we build our system and maintain a system? Because I think over the next 10 years, the utilities will have to be around to provide that infrastructure for the gas side and the electric side. But with, we always built our system to serve these big power plants, for example. Well, if you start going to more of a distributed generation model, we're going to have to build our system differently and maintain our system and operate it differently. I'd also have to say that the change in how it will operate, when you went from the old thermal plants for electric generation, they started and they ramped up over hours. Now you have, the need is sudden and immediate. I mean, the wind stops, cloud cover comes over, and renewable power drops off the grid. And you have to make it up some way. And that's the quick start units that will go from cold to 100% in 15 minutes. The gas system's not built that way. So it will change for us. The other thing is that I mentioned climate change. When you start looking at how do you decarbonize or reduce the carbon impact of the gas side, and that's replacing with renewable natural gas, for example.
Right.
And power plants and transportation can have the same carbon reduction benefit as renewable power.
Right. Okay, interesting. Michel?
Yeah, I'd just like to pull in maybe some other dimension, other markets, other urgencies, other burning platforms. In some other geographies, as we cover globally, there are some burning platforms around competition. We didn't talk about competition, but for an electrical utility, now we're talking about retailers that are coming from the telecom business, Google or Tesla or any of that net new competition is now competing to get the customers. So we're talking geographies where customer churn, like the telcos, had to suffer with. They had 65% erosion of customers in 1 year. So did they have to transform? Yes. They have to go into new business models that will trigger all about customer experience that we heard this morning, using digital, going as simple as they could be, maybe because they're all men, as Kelly was saying, but being as simple as possible, one-click type of approach. You enroll into a type of customer engagement with your utility, and now, boom, you're in, and you buy that package of electricity at that deal. It could be gas or anything else, but in those markets, European markets, for instance, big challenge, big competition. They're really suffering. It's a death spiral financially right now for these guys. So they need to bring new business models, as the title says. So in some other markets where it's regulated, and where I live actually is a perfect market for any type of utility, we don't feel that urgency. We don't feel why exchange now. So, but we think that utilities need to become energy services companies, not just energy management services, but energy services company that can provide multiple sources of energy, including renewables, including the batteries and PVs and everything else that will help them not lose the customer, service the customer as they know best how to serve a customer, and then deploy much more services. So this requires new business models.
Right.
In some cases, utilities are more conservative than others businesses, and therefore they may have to extract these piece of new business model and partner with some other. I'm not talking for my business here, but partner with some others in order to get quicker on the market with those new business models.
Yeah, I mean, Germany's an interesting case because, they do have, the highest, penetration rate of, solar power in the world, and, they have been kind of undergoing some of these issues. Have they, I assume kind of you work with global utilities. How are you seeing them actually do that in practice? Because, people can talk about these new models, but are the customers really ready for them yet? Is the regulatory model ready for them yet? That's kind of where it starts to get like reality versus, PowerPoint, I guess.
In these cases, E.ON, for instance, they went from a very profitable company to a company who had 3 billion euros debt or deficit in 1 year. So yes, they had to change. They went into a program called 1 to 2. So they became 2 companies, and they carved out all of the digital business in order to take care of those customers, because they had tremendous issue with customer churn. In some other geographies, like GDF Suez became NG, and they're going a similar way where all of the customer experience business will be brought in a new digital, agile type of company. So as I said, New Zealand, for instance, you could see power retailers on the net where you don't even meet with your utility, you just buy electricity on the net like that, register as if you were going to Amazon, and that's it. So different markets, different approaches, obviously, that's not one size fits all. But you could see in 10 years, maybe it's going to be more of a North American issue than it is in Europe or elsewhere globally right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, solar is definitely growing quickly. I mean, you kind of brought this up in your opening remarks, Roger. The crux of I think this whole question comes down to this moving from a centralized system to a distributed one, really, because that really does. It seems to be the main driver in terms of what will cause some kind of shift in the actual business model of the utility, and it's not all that structurally different from computing moving from mainframes to laptops and smartphones, and telecoms moving from kind of centralized network architectures to distributed ones. I guess one of the in the electric world, that's pretty simple to understand. You've got distributed solar being put on rooftops, you've got electric vehicles, so you've got new types of load, you've got energy storage, you've got a number of other energy management things kind of behind the meter. Is there any analogous kind of shift like that in either gas or water that you guys are kind of seeing, or is it a little bit more straightforward view?
I'd have to, there's some shift. It's not as dramatic, I think, or as sudden as it's happening on the electric side. But a lot of it is in response to what's happening on the electric side. When you have the need for distributed generation that is beyond the renewables to manage the grid on more of a localized basis, we have to look at our system and how we manage that as well. It's also the customer's desire to have information about their usage and how they can manage it. We're in about 80% done with our installation of our smart grid, smart meters. We call them advanced meters. So the amount of data, we're sitting a little over 4 million customers now that have them installed, soon to be about 5.5 million. That information will be how the customers can then manage their system and what we do with it. We're obviously looking at, you mentioned electric vehicles. We're looking at natural gas vehicles, especially with the climate change issues in California and the NOx issues in Southern California in particular. The South Coast Air Quality Management District, which makes up a large portion of our service territory, has the worst air in the country. And transportation contributes probably the most to NOx to that. Natural gas in the heavy-duty truck sector, new technology has been developed and been certified that could get a 90% reduction from diesel in NOx pollutions. I mean, that's kind of the driver. So how do you service that type of load, which is now different than a house sitting there that's going to stay there for 50 years, right, versus a vehicle that moves around and wants to fuel, whether it's here at Bakersfield or at Blythe or wherever else in the service territory. How are you going to meet those needs?
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think for us, just as Roger said, there's pressures on the electric side that sort of bleed over onto the gas side of the business, but it's not nearly as intense and not driven by the kind of technology step changes that we're experiencing on the electric side. But part of the bleed over is that the customer doesn't say this, they don't segment that, right? This is my gas and this is my electric. It's, I'm getting energy from your company. What information am I getting that helps me? Or as Kelly McDonald said this morning, what's the advice we're rendering? And the advice isn't, the customer's not segmenting those because they know they get both from us. So for that reason, I think there's the shift on the gas side is more about how we're addressing the bundle of services as opposed to a shift in business model per se. But how about on the water side?
Well, not so much an analogous situation on the water side, but on the wastewater side, definitely. There's a lot more interest in, for instance, on-site treatment. For us, our solution, I mean, one of our biggest issues right now, of course, is the drought and in our water supply here in California. And so Our solution for that is a very robust program to implement indirect potable reuse, basically recycled water treated to potable standards. Over the next, the first phase will be done in 2021, and then the rest of it done in 2035. But that relies on a supply of wastewater. Well, if we now have businesses deciding to do this treatment themselves on site, that's actually taking from the supply of potential potable water that we have. So there's trade-offs, and so we're going through the task of kind of evaluating what's the impact, and then even our own recycled water program will have an impact on that to make sure that we have the wastewater supply that we need to provide that basically sustainable, drought-proof, potable water supply. I do agree with you that, for instance, our customers, when we talk about water or wastewater, they don't differentiate between the two services. And I think helping folks understand, getting them more engaged in the conversation, understand what the difference is between the two systems. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the comment, well, why is my wastewater charge higher than my water charge? Well, they're completely independent. They don't have anything to do with one another, but they also come on one bill, and they're only looking at the cost of the bill. These other things, they're disconnected, they're different issues. And so having a conversation with customers, it's difficult to do it in a short, easy to understand conversation. And so that more robust engagement, getting them involved in the conversation, whatever the tools are that we can use to do it, but helping customers understand the differences and what the challenges are, and then what we're doing to address them.
Right.
One area of collaboration, obviously, between water and electric and gas is how could we share all of the same systems? If the utility is already in its territory, has all of the required systems, has the big data installed, and we know usually water utilities are much smaller and bigger number. They don't have, this is a high cost for a water utility to get in same type of customer experience. But what if those systems were shared? What if those systems were available and that the electrical utility becomes a partner to a water utility? And that obviously will help everybody else advance into their ways of better managing the customer and their transformation.
Yeah,
Right.
let me add to that. You know, one thing we've done, and I mentioned our advanced meters we put in, it's the grid that we also set up, and working with the water companies for some pilot programs on how they can use our grid to support their installation of advanced water meters. You know, we have a long-standing partnership with LADWP, with some of the other cities, to try to work on how we can partner on whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's other activities. But the use of the grid, we have space, why not allow others to use that space, especially when they're smaller and they can't afford to build out the whole system that they'd like to see.
Right. Okay, so I think we all agree that the business model will definitely look different. How different and what the differences may be, I think is, you know, still a lot up in the air, and there's some indicators of what's happening. But along the way, you know, to that, you know, next 10 years, you know, various utilities in various regions have kind of different kind of major challenges in kind of getting into that space. So I guess, what do you guys see as the biggest challenges facing utilities in the next 10 years? And Michelle, maybe you can kind of start, because you're looking at a number of utilities in a number of regions, or, you know, what are like one or two examples of things that, you know, you might hear most often?
Basically, it's time. As you mentioned it, short term in utility usually is 10 years. So a strategic plan is 20 years. So these things are happening right now. And it's right, you don't want to be the next to try the new technology, even though this is an Itron conference. We all like the best and brightest ideas that come from vendors. How fast can you change within your own organization? So sometimes new business models, I think, is something that can help. If you can carve out some of those ideas, put them into a new organization, so this organization has the will and the power and the support of the board to change quickly. I think the real thing is fast. How can you do it fast? You need to do it now. And you need to test it on smaller scale, but you definitely need to do it now. So is it with the new customer experience? Is it with the new renewables? Is it, how do you share with your neighbors water or gas? but definitely needs for changes now, and how can you test it quickly? I think that's the first thing I would highlight for sure.
Okay, great. And then before I just want to mention one thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning of the session. So we are going to, right around 10 after the hour, open it up for audience Q&A. There's actually the conference app has a place where you can actually submit questions, and they'll actually come into me on this iPad. So if you'd like to do that, you can kind of do that at your leisure as the panel goes along, and we'll get to some audience Q&A towards the end. And if not, if you don't use the app or you don't have the app, we will have people with microphones that we can, do it that way as well. I just didn't want to forget to mention that so that we can make sure that we've got some good Q&A at the end, but to keep going with the challenges.
So, we talked about one of the challenges earlier, and that was the changing employees and the need to have our rollover of existing employees, our generation employees that will be leaving the utilities. That's one challenge. The other is the rapidly changing customer expectation and needs. To be able to keep up with that is very difficult, especially when you look at a utility, and I'll use us with 5.5 million customers. You're going to have a lot of difference between a new customer versus a customer who's been, taking service from you for 20, 30 years. And that change in expectations across that wide spectrum makes it very difficult, and it's very challenging. Do you keep the call center so people can call? Do you move everything to a digital world? Is everything on your phone nowadays? And it's a very tough challenge. The other thing in California, I think, is the role that the regulators and agencies and legislatures are going to play in directing us on what they believe we should do. In California, it's climate change and reduction of greenhouse gas. How they basically will instruct the utilities whether they can play in the space or cannot play in the space. I think that is a very difficult challenge to be able to manage that process with the regulators.
Gotcha.
Obviously, in California, probably our biggest issue right now is the drought, climate change, and water supply. So I think that's definitely all of our focus is there. One of the things I think is, I wanted to touch on something that Michelle said really about time. And so right now, we've got a lot of focus, a great deal of support to do a huge project that's going to take 35 years, or until 2035 to complete. And everybody, we have great support, but the time it will take to do that project and get it completed, we know if the drought, we're going into El Nino, so we suffer with that every day. What's the message? I think that our supporters and stakeholders do not have the attention span or not in a negative way, but it's just they're not focused on it for that period of time. And so they don't see the benefit coming right back to them. They want something right now. And I think that's our difficulty, is this is an industry where these things do take time. You can't do them overnight. There's a lot of hurdles to go to get through. And I think it's moving as fast as it can, but keeping the attention and the support of those people that are really important to making it successful. So I think that's probably one of the key issues we have.
Right.
That's a really good observation, because you have this intergenerational shift, right, that's happening, and it's a transfer of costs and benefits, and the people that get one piece of that pie are going to be different over time. That's a really good and tough issue.
Well, one other thing I think is a lot of the decisions we make are based on, for instance, these projects are not cheap. It takes a great deal of investment.
Yeah.
The real driver is that the cost of not doing it is so much higher. But that's a very difficult concept to get to most customers who are paying those higher rates and other stakeholders to really understand.
We thought it was just the electric industry that had
No.
Maybe to put a little different context on this, if we went back a few generations during the peak of the baby boomer years, we didn't have the technology drivers. Everything was kind of relatively stable. We went for 10 years without a rate change. We had improvement projects and capital budgets, but they were a fraction of what they are today as the infrastructure has aged and shifted requirements. As we fast forward to this generation, this time, this era, we have these intergenerational issues going on, and step changes in technology, changes in demography that are both influential on customers and their expectations, but also on our employee workforce. And of course, we have a step change too, or no, this is not the right way to say it. We don't have a step change in regulation. Maybe policy, but not in regulation. In fact, this whole situation we're in now, it gives a new meaning to regulatory lag. A lot of times we think about it as a financial lag, but the reality is the technology is changing at a much faster pace, and the policy is changing at a faster pace, and customer expectations are following that, but regulation is stuck in precedent by design. It's not like they're trying to be bad guys, it's just the way things are designed.
Yeah,
and I think that's one of the big challenges we face is all these step changes are happening around us, but we're not in a context that allows us as a society to respond very quickly to adapt.
Yeah, that's really troubling, and it's a struggle, and it kind of leads into the next question. You know, that we do have, like you said, some, you know, you've got vendors out there, whether they be large, you know, established vendors like Itron or smart or nimble startups that are coming up with, you know, essentially brand new product ideas that don't even necessarily fit into the current architecture of the electric grid or other types of utilities. And you know, they're not like sitting there developing these new products thinking about the regulatory structure. They're assuming, right, that something will change so that this product can be adapted into a functional use case. And clearly the utilities are interfacing with all these vendors, and so you know, you've got your emerging technologies groups and your strategy groups, and you're, you know, getting a good sense of, you know, what technologies out there, which ones you might be able to use today versus 5 years from now, just from a technological perspective. But I guess two things. I mean, so that's all kind of moving, like you said, but it is troubling to kind of see the regulatory bodies, you know, not being as innovative. Does a whole nother, you know, kind of trend need to happen there where they're actually, you know, looking at how they actually, you know, regulate the utilities? And then B, they're almost, you know, kind of a third party, literally, but also in a sense that they're not at the table in a lot of these emerging technologies discussions to get a really good understanding of what value that might bring to your customers. So then it's harder for them to kind of approve a rate case or the funding for various projects or whatever. So is the regulatory construct being innovative at all, or ad hoc, and how is it impacting the business? You know, we see what's kind of happening with REV. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting things happening in California and other states. Like, talk a bit about what needs to happen on the regulatory side.
I think regulators have to go where the people want to go. They are, in my mind, a service needs to happen. They're not at utility service, they're at the people service. The only problem we see again is time. It's not that they don't want to do it, it's just that it takes time to move such a big organization and lots of rules and decrees and everything else. Wherever we've seen a real burning platform like a drought here in California or a bankruptcy of a major utility going in billions of euros of debt, regulators had to quickly adjust. And so what we think is some of the trends and innovation that's taking place, especially for consumers becoming prosumers, getting totally off-grid, that's going to create a big issue for not only the utilities, but for the regulators as well. They will have to adjust. So who's the best to propose services other than a utility, helping your own customers getting off-grid so they can reuse their own electricity or gas usage, or a community power, for instance, where they could all share in a gated community that same power that was generated, but with the help of utility. We have projects in the Netherlands showing that.
But then there has to be incentive for them to do that.
So the regulator, he had to adjust to what the power in this island. There's 6,000 people. They took charge of their utility needs, and they created with the local utility, a smaller utility called Threshold Island, and the regulator just went with it and said, okay, it's going to be a pilot for me to help change some other stuff that I need to change. So similarly, I think the drought here in California is bringing a lot of discussions on how electrical companies can work with water utilities and such. I think it's going to happen with all of the other trends and innovations that's going to take up. It's just a matter of urgency, burning platforms, and making it happen.
That's the most telling thing in your remarks, is that there had to be a burning platform. The utility was in crisis, the customers were rising up in demand, and then the utilities regulator responded in some favorable or more innovative way. There had to be a crisis of water for California to really delve in.
Exactly.
Right? But the architecture question is a different one, because we have new policies that are being advocated on all fronts that touch the utility industries in many different ways, but a regulatory practice that doesn't allow those new policies to be adapted or incorporated very rapidly, unless there's a crisis. and that, by the way, is not a fault, it's by design. I had I won't name the city I was in because it would implicate the utility, but I had a local researcher at a university in the city approach me at a conference like this and say, I really liked what you had to say about the future utilities, but how do I get my utility to take more risks? And I said, well, time out. Your utility by design is not supposed to take more risk. They are paid because the services we render, all of these, are part of the very fabric of the economy and the communities we serve. We're paid to make sure that stays on all the time. So new risk is not the right idea. And this was a foreign concept to him, that the regulator's job and the way we were architected is to protect and support that service. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be room for innovation, for sure. And this topic in particular, I think it's absolutely critical that we find a way. And we see glimmers of hope in non-burning platforms, right? Non-critical situations, a little bit in the More Than Smart campaigns that are going on in California. And certainly the very deliberate approach that's going on in New York, whatever you might think about it, it's very deliberate, both in examining and opening the door to a conversation about how the market might be different, and then the regulator asking the next wave of questions, well, if that's the way the market needs to work or could work, what would have to be different about regulation? And it's the first time I've seen where the regulator has said, maybe there's a different design that would actually enable a new architecture that would align our regulatory practice with future policy of where we want to go, not just depend on the precedent of where we've been.
Yeah.
But it's the only example I know about that.
Well, I'm going to follow up to that question. So along those lines, yes, utilities, they don't inherently want to take risks because the main fundamental service is reliability, safety, et cetera, et cetera. Do you believe that? I mean, you can do like modeling essentially that shows like more distributed systems are inherently more reliable. I mean, the internet is inherently distributed and it's a very reliable system. You'll have little outages here and there, but you don't have, a blackout like you do during Hurricane Sandy. Do you feel that, and I think getting to those distributed systems, there's risk and reliability that goes along with that, but do you fundamentally think that it is more reliable to be totally distributed?
Yeah, from my opening remarks, absolutely. The future is more distributed and more integrated. I don't think it's one or the other, I think it's both, and we're clearly going to skate in that direction. The question on the table about regulation is how fast we're enabled to get there.
Yeah.
And clearly the policy drivers are in that favor. The technology is in that favor. Customer expectations are in that favor. But a regulatory architecture that depends on precedent and avoiding intergenerational costs, shifts of costs, doesn't speed that along.
Yeah, and what do you guys think is behind the
Well, I think the point, what hinders us is the pace of change that the regulators can live with and deal with. Because again, they have to make sure that we're the utility there to provide that safe and reliable service at reasonable rates for customers. So it's an education process on our side. I mean, they're getting exposed to it. In California, a good example is, they regulate taxis. That whole Uber issue versus taxis they've had to deal with. So they're getting bits and pieces of different technology. How they allow the utilities to apply it to their operations will be an education part on our side. We've done some things that have actually moved a little bit of the ball forward on non-traditional utility services. They're actually equipment that we own behind the meter for compression, for biogas conditioning, for distributed energy resources. And we have in front of the commission today. So it's on us to educate them on how the benefits of a system change or a new service will benefit and meet the customer's needs, because we drove it all back to the customer needs. And this is what the customers want. This is how they'd like us to participate as, you know, their trusted energy advisor.
Right.
So,
Right. Make any thoughts on your side?
I was going to say, I mean, I think, again, we have both experiences where we've made some great inroads with regards to regulation, for instance, of the indirect potable reuse, because we need federal and state law to resolve some of the issues for us for that project to move forward. At the same time, when you look at the recent drought and the conservation measures and that were essentially directed via an executive order without much consideration, I think, how you would implement those, and the pain it went, all agencies, I think, worked through to implement those changes. We've achieved those numbers, I think, across the state, but there was little forethought about how that would be implemented. I think in some sense, that gives us the power to work it out, but when we're talking about the diverse number of agencies with different issues, it was painful for a period of time. We still, I think, in some cases don't know if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but we look at the outcomes and see that at least we're hitting the right outcomes. So I think that there's both examples out there, and I think, but I do see that, in some of the bigger issues where we're looking to move forward and deal with some of these, what I would call hard trends that are, and challenges that are coming up, that we have definitely made some inroads and been more collaborative with regulators and how to make those changes.
Right. Okay, great. Next question. One of the, beyond, reliability and safety and, fair rates and things like that, I mean, one of the fundamental roles that you play is, constantly balancing supply and demand. And obviously you've gotten very good at that with the system that has kind of been in place for a number of years. And then again, this kind of distributed nature comes up, and there's a whole new set of challenges, and potentially in the renewables, whether they be centralized utility-owned renewables or totally distributed, customer-owned renewables, and whether there's storage available or not. All these things are variables that go into probably a more complex balancing of supply and demand in the future. So I guess the question is, given that challenge, how do you see that changing over the next 10 years, and what do you think kind of that impact will have on your business or your business model?
You've got the 5 million customers. I don't have that.
We talked about it briefly. When we talked about distributed generation and how that impacts the system from the standpoint of having to build out in areas to serve, microgrids or whatever it might be, it's a lot different than having a main transmission line serving a power plant. We've been fortunate enough on the gas side that we've had storage. In Southern California here, we have what could amount to about 15% of our annual consumption in storage, on a regular basis. But it really says, okay, so how can we as the gas utility help facilitate the integration of this drive for renewables? We look at, technology changes, and you mentioned Germany, is power to gas. Because there are periods of the day when there's too much renewable resources, and if you could take that excess power, run it through electrolysis to generate hydrogen, and then use the natural gas system as that storage by injecting that hydrogen or reformation, bring it back to methane, you create renewable natural gas. That can help integrate the renewables. Those changes are what we have to look at as different, because we've been running fossil fuel through our system for how long? 140 years. What's the next step that we're going to have to use our system to support the direction of the state? So,
Just as a follow-up, you have a lot of solar penetration with your utility, and I've read that Arizona has struggled with some advances on rooftop solar where some circuits are actually overloaded and the utility doesn't have control, so now they're worried about literally a circuit could burn down under certain circumstances, and of course it creates a real challenge in public and political. Are you facing anything like that with solar penetration on your side, and how are you addressing that kind of a challenge?
I have not heard that. Our sister utility, San Diego Gas and Electric, is the highest renewables in the state. They're at 33, 34%. They're facing, how do they manage their grid when you have those pockets of high penetration of solar? And that's a very big concern for them. And then you layer onto that, electric cars. I think they have the highest penetration of electric vehicles in San Diego. And how do you manage that? I think it becomes very difficult. And then also, what kind of infrastructure do you have to put in to manage that? Then you layer on that, okay, so what's that rate impact for customers? It becomes a complex issue because for the gas side, we're kind of fortunate.
It's it's funny because we at GTM, we have a group of industry experts along this topic called the Grid Edge Executive Council, and SDG&E is a member. I don't know if you guys know Tom Bialek and Lee Cravat, but Tom is he's an engineer specifically looking at that problem in a lot of great detail, because I know that at SDG&E they have been modeling very specifically circuits where they are over a penetration rate. They're trying to figure out what exactly that percentage is, and they're looking, like a lot of other utilities, at pretty interesting power electronics technologies beyond smart inverters to help with that problem. But that's a big, kind of a big issue.
So on the topic then of load and demand balance, I think that's where the issue lies, right? There's ample power. The question is, when does it come, and how do you make sure it's in the right place at the right time for the right people on the right circuit? And so because of the new technologies and the differential adoption rates, you have a different optimization strategy you have to take on that we haven't faced before. So it's not, in my mind's eye, it's not so much about the availability of the energy or the capacity, but it's about how everything functions in an interactive way.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we really think that storage will make a tremendous leap of progress. It is costing less and less, and a lot of researchers are working on better and smaller batteries that can operate year-long in cold temperature and not warm temperature. We really believe that the combination of PV and storage will definitely change the grid. Microgrids will take care of some of the issues that we have right now. We're seeing already megawatts of batteries. We're seeing utilities buying 21 megawatts of batteries in order for them to maintain their existing grid. So what if in 10 years, because we're talking 10 years, what will be the cost of storage? We all saw Tesla battery, wall batteries. Okay, that's a small step. But what if we were at that point in 10 years with storage? Everybody would have storage. Everybody would have a PV roof. And the cost of producing and transporting and distributing electricity will be so low when it's done local. Is it the case where this is the highest price we're going to pay for your electricity? In 10 years will be so cheap that we'll have to manage still customer experience, still how to get all of that integrated and such, but what if it's all local and in storage?
Right. Yeah. Now, storage is interesting, and it certainly is getting cheaper. I think one of the things where, one of the big drivers of PV getting cheaper was it piggybacked a lot on the manufacturing process and capacity of kind of the semiconductor business. So it was relatively uniform across the solar industry, whereas storage, you've got a lot of different chemistries and different manufacturing technologies. Yes, things like, the gigafactory and things like that can bring kind of manufacturing scale to reduce the cost, but it'll be interesting to see if it follows a similar curve or it's going to take a little bit longer.
But it's coming.
It is coming. I guess that leads into another question. Let's talk a little bit about technology. So we've been talking a lot about the business model, and fundamentally, a lot of the technological things that are happening are impacting the model. At GTM, we look at a lot of different, grid side technologies, consumer side technologies, and just from our, traffic and interest in, various articles and research that we publish, we've been, I'd say over the past, probably like 2 years ago, the big interesting idea was big data and analytics, and over the last, 12 months, storage has clearly been of very, very high interest in microgrids to some lesser extent. What are some, from your guys' perspective, some of the most, promising or interesting technologies that you see coming down the road? You want to start,
Let's
Mike?
hear the
You
water.
start.
That gives us time to think.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously for us, the investment in indirect potable reuse and what that will do as far as creating a basically sustainable, long-term drought-proof supply, that's where the majority of our focus is right now. But our investment in, unfortunately, we're on the other side of the distributed energy issue here because we're producing more and more energy. In fact, we're investing in a pump storage facility now, and it's probably one of the, I think it's our interest in doing some of these really, really large projects that we would have never considered doing in the past because we have some skin in the game in these, and rather than having another larger regional agency do them, then we're actually staying involved. So I think between energy and water supply, and then as far as other areas of new technology, I think just specifically, I mean, when we started our AMI project, that was several years ago, we had to sell it. We're doing a small initial implementation, but the change in understanding and value for that data has just completely changed. Before it was, how are we going to sell this $80 million project? Fortunately, the cost has come down. But now, as we with the drought, using some of the current issues to really support the need for AMI, as we move forward with our citywide deployment, there's no interest in the cost. People just don't care. That's just something that we should provide to support our customers. And then on the other side, I think as an agency, the value of that information, we've struggled through the last 2 years not having that level of granularity of what our customers are doing. We already have from just a system operation standpoint, our water modeling group, they're at the door every day. Can we get this information, even for the customers where we are now? So I think those are probably the three what I call most key from a technology standpoint. Those are really our key focuses. Right?
Okay, great. Roger?
Yeah, I'll pile on that. 'Cause here's how our industry migrates, right? We think about AMI or AMR and all the data we're going to get. And then our next problem is meter data management. And boy, we feel really good when we solve that equation, right? Oh, I got a meter data management system. But all you did was figure out where to store bits of information. And we're not converting it to value. So the case I would make is that the single most important or most influential technology in our business model future is, in fact, what we do with big data. So by definition, big data means more velocity, it's coming at us faster, more volume, greater numbers, and more variety. This is one of the reasons that 2 doors down, they're talking about smart cities. And that I think Roger mentioned it earlier. Maybe there's a way we could use our infrastructure to make it help gather data for other people doing other things that aren't even energy related. The chance to gather more diverse information is an option, is an opportunity, but it's not value. The value comes from doing the analytics, and the analytics aren't the old push the Excel spreadsheet and figure it out. This is the application of advanced analytics, data science, which isn't a person, it's a discipline, and it's a discipline that crosses many different functions of mathematics and statistics and science. When that gets applied to the greater and greater volume and variety of information we get, we can't help but find new things to serve our customers, new ways to improve how we operate our infrastructure, whether it's water, gas, or electricity. So I think my answer is that the biggest, most fundamental technology change that's upon us, the greatest opportunity, lies in the information, but only if we do something with it.
Yeah, and I'll stay on that theme. We're collecting all the customer data. We're collecting all the operational data. How can we merge that all together and use analytics to come up with how we can modify our system, especially if our system has to change to meet customer demands. Because it changed and it says, okay, now we can use that to optimize our system operation and maybe reverse flows of pipe, maybe we just expand in a certain area and not another. I think that's going to be very critical. The more information you have is not necessarily the best. It's how you use the information to get better.
If I could build on one more piece of that maybe this audience will appreciate. Again, our tendency as an industry is always to look at what we have. And we have operational data, and we have customer data, right? But there's a whole world out there of information. I know of one company that has regularly updated information on 310 million premise addresses in the United States. And it's on everything you can imagine that's outside of our business. So is there something in that data about consumers, about individuals, just like Kelly McDonald talked about, all the differentiations that can happen with a consumer base, that when combined with our data, our utility data, could yield even more? Here's another way to think about it. If we were to look at the relationship in a community or in a district of energy flow, gas and electric, relative to water, we can begin to think that there's probably a relationship, particularly on electric pumping loads. But what's the relationship of those two things to occupancy in the buildings, weather patterns, traffic, pedestrian, and how do those things relate to human health or any number of other vectors that might be assessed? So the value potential of information, when combined with the data that we have as the industry, it can change the world, starting one community, one district, one city at a time. But not if we're not doing something with it. And I think that goes back to, so it is our data for sure, and it is our operations we can make better for sure, but there's another value potential, and it goes to taking our data and sharing it in appropriate ways and analyzing it with in concert with other information that yields new insights.
Michelle?
So maybe two areas of, and again, going in the same direction, regulator permits. There will be a big change for utility, not just to become a utility. We'll be a services company. We'll definitely provide more than one service, regardless if it's water, gas, or electricity. Why not? If we're able to serve customers, then why can't we serve them with some other services? It's been used before, but I'm pretty sure now with all of that technology and new ideas and new technology coming out, then it will definitely be areas right now, burning platforms happening elsewhere. Companies are really moving from utility to energy services company. The second area where we see improvement, and I think you've mentioned it, Roger, is the telecom business. A lot of lessons learned in the telecom business, how they had to transform. Who's looking at what price per minute I'm paying on my bill right now when I talk to someone? Never. Why should we still bill our utility customers the same way we did? Are we selling electrons? Are we selling a kilowatt? What if, and as I mentioned in some different markets right now, what if I was customer type A, type B, or type C? I get a pre-bundled package of electricity that includes also some other services, like security, like monitoring for the elderly, like all kinds of other services. I'm customer type A. As Kelly mentioned, multiple types of customers. I think the utility of the future becomes a services company, and in those services, electricity will be provided as much as water, as much as gas, as much as other services. And these things are happening elsewhere in the world right now, so just make sure you see that as a potential for our utilities to become also similar businesses.
Right. All right, we're going to have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience Q&A. We've had a number kind of come in through the app. But so final question, why don't we just kind of start with Roger, and we'll kind of work down the line. Given everything we've just discussed and all the kind of dynamic scenarios that are kind of going on at the moment, what is one wish or hope that you have for the industry going forward?
Only one? I guess I've alluded to it already a little bit. I'm going to focus on electricity, but what I'll have to share with you maybe applies to the other utility services as well. Power, we're the hot in your shower and the cold in your beer, and light at a flip at a switch, right? Which, by the way, there's 1 billion people on the planet that haven't seen a light switch. We're the most empowering invention of all time, right? We relieve the burdens of work, we power productivity, we enable entertainment, we connect people, well, most people. Arab Spring came around, and Twitter got credit for helping enable that, but it wouldn't have happened but for a reliable power system somewhere that powered those devices. I have to tell you a story about it. Again, I won't name the utility or the executive, but I was at a meeting, long boardroom table, and people around it, and I made that statement that electricity, people, is the most empowering invention of all time. And one gentleman leaned forward and said, no, it's the internet. And all of the heads at the table looked at him, and he goes, oh, because he's a utility executive. It's so easy for us to lose sight of the power and the potency of the things that we represent, the fundamental services that change a community's ability to prosper. And by community, I mean people, our neighbors, right? So my wish, that's the backdrop, right? So my wish, my hope for all of us, that we are decision makers and thought leaders in our industries, in our communities. It's high time for us to stand up and be champions for the service we provide, not allow our industry to be commoditized as something that happens in the background, but to really step forward and be a voice and an advocate for these kinds of changes in a way that helps us serve all of humanity better. That's my wish.
Okay. Mike?
I think everything that Roger said was absolutely, I think, on point. And just to add on to that, I mean, I think that it kind of starts with us. We have to understand how important our business is and how it impacts individual customers, our employees, businesses, certainly. You know, if you think about, and water is a little different than energy, I think we get called a right rather than a convenience, but which makes it a little bit more difficult for us sometimes. But it really is, and when you look at places within the world that don't have access to water or other utilities, I'd prefer not to live there. So I think that, but it kind of starts with us, and we have to be looking forward, and how can we build that relationship with our customers. We recently did something with our employees, and we asked them to come up with a 30-second elevator speech. And we videotaped them, and I'll tell you, it was the most touching thing I've ever seen in my entire career. Our folks, our frontline folks especially, sitting there and talking about how important, how much they appreciated working for the City of San Diego and the Public Utilities Department, and sharing that with our customers and helping. And so I think going forward, I just want to continue to grow that kind of enthusiasm, and then also hope that also helps our customers, us deliver better customer service and really sustain this organization and this industry for the long term, because it really does a lot of important work.
So Mike, I'll disagree with you on one part, and that's, you know, sometimes that desert island looks pretty good, because how many of us feel that just when we don't have cell service, it's kind of refreshing to put your phone down, right? We're always on our smartphone. The one thing I would hope, and you know, this touches on what Roger says and Mike and Michelle, is really allow the utilities to participate. Give us a seat at the table. We have a lot of great people, very innovative, very dedicated, comes up with great ideas. So allow the utility to participate and to present solutions to be that energy services provider, that trusted energy advisor that the customer is looking for. We all come up with the innovative ideas, so, you know, it's kind of the call out to the regulators and the agencies is allow us a seat at the table and allow us to participate. So
yeah, that's a good point.
Exactly what I was saying. Collaboration. I think it's all about collaboration between regulators, utilities, and the consumers. The real customers, they know what they want. They can see it. They know where they want to be with all of this new technology. And somewhat the utilities has to fight with the regulator and the time. And it's taking too much time. So my big wish is that everybody sits at the same table, cut the time by half minimum, so at least we can see changes before 2025.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we have a number of questions that have come in through the app. So I don't know if we probably won't get to all these, but we'll get to as many as we can, and then I'm sure that the panelists would be happy to. I'll take one from the floor to start with, sure. We have a mic here, so just wait 1 second.
Hi, I'm Farah Said with Frost & Sullivan. I have a question for you, Michael. You talk about, or you foresee the utility company to become an energy service provider. Can you shed some thoughts as to what their earning model would look like potentially? Because at the moment, it's really return on equity. It's really based on the amount of investments they make on actual capital equipment. So what kind of, do you have any thoughts on that regarding their earning model, what that would potentially look like as a service provider?
Well, I was talking about burning platform, and one of the burning platforms of those companies right now, they have a revenue churn. They could see isolation, producers, microgrids. Now, some revenues are fading away, and they need to replace those revenues. So they either choose to go into a separate business, a deregulated business that would allow them to build such capital, and then investors to come in and help them, but all under the umbrella of a utility. So that's basically the idea around it.
I see. So basically you're advocating deregulation.
Under-regulated business, a deregulated arm that would focus on new business models. Okay. I think that's the best approach, the quickest approach.
Okay. There's a great question here I'll start with. Compare our industry to the U.S. Postal Service. What is our Achilles heel like the internet was for them? How can we adapt? What lessons are there for us?
I'm not familiar with the U.S. Postal Service.
So I'll give it a shot. One, I don't like being
That's
compared.
okay. We're happy to have you go first.
Yeah. I guess the Postal Service, and you can look at magazines and how they missed changing what they would do in newspapers. I think what we have to look at is on a going forward basis, how are the customer needs going to change? To predict what happens 10 years from now, 15 years, 20 years from now is very difficult. But we have to be adaptable to be able to make some changes, and whether it's how we model our system, how we operate our system, how we build our system out. We're not necessarily as disposable as maybe, at least I hope, disposable as like the Postal Service or the newspaper, and the change may not occur. But if batteries become big and people can completely disconnect from the grid, that changes the whole game for a lot of people. So we just have to be adaptable and look forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and start changing now and not till be after the fact.
Yeah. Do you think there are, that's a pretty extreme case and pretty black and white case of like what the internet had done to some of those old businesses. Do you think that there's another type of competitor out there, or like another model?
Yeah. Again, don't know a lot about the Postal Service. I understand the concept of the question, though. And I think if I focus on the Achilles heel aspect of that, what I would say, and Roger triggered this in me when he talked about the importance of being adaptable. So the reverse of that is that you're intransigent. You're just stuck, right? I'm here to defend the status quo. Well, that, I think, is the Achilles heel of our industry. This idea that somehow the world can change around us, but we don't have to. And if you or your leadership has that mindset, then I think you're at higher risk than those of us that are saying no. We want to moderate this. We want to do it in a way that makes the most sense economically and for intergenerational transfer of costs and those kinds of things. But we're more apt to embrace a change as opposed to resist it. And it's the resistance that I think is the Achilles heel.
I agree with that.
So maybe I'd like to propose a name. The name of a word is the utility has to become an orchestrator of all of that change.
Yes.
And not just looking at batteries and how it could harm them, or how the other venture capital like Google coming in through as a retailer, or SunPower being a competitor. So how as a utility, you're already there, you're into a territory, you already serve your customer. Yes, you are compared with telcos and other call centers, but what if you were this orchestrator? What if you become this energy services company that can embrace all of that new technology and propose? And there are some examples, even in the US, like Tucson Electric installing PVs now because they were competed by some other companies. So what if you become an orchestrator? So as you said, I think one of the biggest issue would be, what if a utility doesn't want to change? That's the issue.
And part of that change that the utility want to change is to change the culture within the company. You know, utility culture is very, almost family-oriented. People have been with the company for a long time. You have to change that culture to believe that we're at risk. You know, we're just not the utility. We're not going to be there. We get regulated returns. But we're at a real competitive threat with gas, maybe not water, give you the one mic, but electric, you know, but even when you look at water reclamation, right? You already said that. So we have to change our culture, be one that's willing to change.
And I would say there is some threat to us because, for instance, conservation. So it's no different, just like in the energy world. People conserve, well, that impacts our revenues and rates, and then continue to get support for that, especially in California where we have a constitutional requirement for certain noticing and things like that for public-owned or for city and municipal-owned utilities like us. But the, I was going to say something, I totally forgot. I'll come back to it.
Fair enough. Trying to pick questions out here that we did. A lot of this we've touched on. Some of it we've kind of tangentially touched on, like this one here. So I think we kind of touched on this question from like a human resources perspective in terms of the utility employee base, but in terms of technology, this question says, the utility industry seems focused on a 20-year life cycle for any asset that is deployed. Do you see that expectation reducing in any way as utilities have to constantly adapt to changing technology?
Do we have an accountant in the room? Okay, that's often what we struggle with is, you know, the life cycle on your iPhone or your computer is way different than what accounting rules may have, or the better example may be software. You know, what's the life cycle on software and how fast does it have to turn and what's the right depreciation rates? And I'm not the guy to answer that question, but it is a question and it's under constant review in my company on various aspects of different elements of our asset base. At the end of the day, our ability to make changes is driven by GAAP accounting rules and what the regulators allow. But we have to ask in order to get a decision out of the regulators. And if we see an opportunity, we need to advocate it before GAAP if some other change is required there. There's a whole, that's like another conference, I think, on that topic.
And what if this new technology coming out allows you to deliver new services or better services, cheaper services? What if you become more even efficient operationally? So why not change that 20-year rule?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's clearly a tie-in with the whole regulatory lag as well. Like, it's totally tied to that question.
Here's an example of new technology that's not software, but a transformer. And today's transformers are way more efficient than the ones from 30 years ago. They last longer, they're more efficient, they're digitally enabled, I can monitor them, I can do lifecycle management on them, right? But the one I put in 40 years ago still works. Now it's not as efficient. So now I got to go get an accounting order in order to take out something that works and throw it away or recycle it in order to put in something that's better with a 2 or 3 or 5 year payback on it. Now in the life of the utility, even on an asset like that that's going to have decades of life, it's still an argument about whether we should do that.
Okay, so there's a question here that actually, it kind of would be a follow-up to that point. So, will regulators ever consider both CapEx and OpEx to be considered when building a rate case in do you see technology? Because I know of several technologies that you could provide that same exact example with, where you have something that's functional, but if you put in this new technology, yes, there's going to be a capital expense, but is the system-wide operational expense a greater benefit?
In our case, whether it was the transformer example or we're in a process right now to expand our AMI deployment, and it's the same story. We're going to take out some meters that work just fine for their single purpose and replace it with a new meter that has way more functionality, way more opportunity for services and insight and improved operations, but there's a cost trade-off. And we have to get the accounting order, the regulatory approval in order to decide to move down that path. So our ability to earn that order from our commission depends on the case we make. So the answer is yes. We look at the trade-offs between capital and O&M and how that affects not just the immediate performance, but the life cycle performance, and not just on the asset, but in our service to customers. And that whole case has to be made and presented as part of the regulatory practice. But that's pretty standard operation, I think. For
Yeah,
utilities.
that's the same thing with us. When we look at our file on our rate cases, we're looking at a variety of projects over, 2, 3, 4 years. And we have to justify those based on the operational benefits, whether, improves safety, improves compliance, will ultimately reduce customer rates over time because of the lower operating costs. Right. That's how you have to justify the projects from the capital side. We think, using, capital versus O&M may be a better approach, not necessarily because we earn on it, because you're able to spread those costs over a period of time and you don't hit the customers all at once with a large cost. So,
Gets back to Michael's point from earlier about, but you still got to explain that the rates are lower because of our action than they would have been, but they're still higher.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Data and analytics came up kind of as a theme throughout the session. Can any of you share specific consumer outcomes in utilizing information from data analytics?
Well, we haven't even gone live with our AMI system, but the network's in place, the endpoints are in place. We're just finishing up some last work before we turn on the interfaces and start using it for billing customers and giving customer access to the data. But for the last 6 to 8 months, everything's been in, so we have access to that data, and our operational folks are using it. So when they get, we're still visually reading the meters, but we're using it. We had a customer that we billed about, normally they pay maybe $600 for water. We billed them $52,000 one month for water. And it seemed reasonable that they could have had a leak and lost this water over a month. What we found was that with the AMI data, we were able to determine that the meter actually incremented that amount within a 1-hour period, which from an engineering perspective, we could not have lost that much water in that period of time. We were in a lawsuit with this customer. This customer would have lost that lawsuit had we not had that data, but it turned out to be a meter error. And it wasn't a meter reading error, it was just a meter malfunction. And so I think that's just one instance on one day that kind of data really helped us, both the customer and us. It would have been embarrassing. We're using that data regularly now, and the system isn't even turned on.
Go ahead. I've got a good one though.
Yeah, well, I got a couple. You look at it from the consumer side. One thing with our advanced meter is providing that information to the customers and trying to change, their behavior when it comes to energy consumption. And we run pilots with test groups and non-test groups, and we found that it's actually made a difference. We were trying to get a certain percentage of behavioral conservation, but we're actually getting a lot higher. It almost becomes a competition. Your neighbor's using this and you're using this. And they said, well, I can change that. The other one that is, I think, more important for us was a case in which the advanced meter data allowed us to find that a customer had a natural gas leak, which could have been a significant issue. But because of that information and the granularity of the information, we were able to go out to the customer on a proactive basis and fix that issue. So that to me was probably bigger than the conservation side, just because it solved a safety problem.
Maybe one example.
Yeah.
One customer now with the metering data being refreshed, so in their case it's every hour. Now they have energy disaggregation, so they know exactly what the customer is using with his electricity. And therefore they can pinpoint which energy savings or energy efficiency programs would work better. And therefore they can plan for how they can reduce the peak with similar packages. And so it helps them understand. You could do it before, every 2 months you would pick up data and then look at it, but real now it's almost real time where they can adjust and help both on the customer experience side and obviously on the energy efficiency side. Reducing the peaks is very important for them. So It's all about big data.
Interesting.
So here's, I could actually go on for a long time about this. There's quite a number of stories that are illustrative of this particular question, but one I think you'll enjoy. So there's a utility in the southeast that had a demand response program. It's one you're familiar with, where they have the ability to dial down an air conditioner during a peak event, and they pay their customer for that right. But of course, their power supply people don't like that because they never know if the customer's going to opt out, because the customer can opt out under their program. And so they were trying to figure out, well, what data do we have? Can we figure out a way to improve the reliability that when we call on the customer to dial down their air conditioner, that they won't opt out? And they looked at all their data internally and couldn't figure out anything. They hire a data science company to figure out what the choices are. And so they're looking across the field of what this utility has at its disposal. And one of the things they know is the customer has signed up, their premise address, and their phone number. Now, these devices have GPS locators on them. And it turns out that some of that data is actually available for a price. And so they were able to basically send out, before they sent the signal out, they could look geographically at where the phone was. So it wasn't about the utilities data. And if the phone for that particular address on that circuit that they were interested in was not at home, the probability of opt-out is next to zero. And if it was home, they could look at the historic record of that particular customer to decide what their pattern would be of opting out or opting in. And from that, they could create an algorithm, a probability model to figure out on these circuits and these circumstances what would happen, what's the likely outcome, can I rely on the power for the dial down I'm going to call for. So totally unexpected, and it's about data that's outside our industry that helps make our industry work better in that one situation. And I got a dozen of those.
That's
so
interesting.
if you want to talk more, just track me down after the event.
And on that note, we have come to the end of our session. I want to first thank you, gentlemen. This has been very informative and eye-opening for me, and as I'm sure it has been for the audience, so thank you for being here. And thank you all for being here as well. And thanks for those that are watching on the live stream. So.